Ah yes, it's that wonderful time where I get to talk about video game soundtracks again. It's like nature is healing, except that we're going to be heading into one of those wackier parts of nature. You know, like those pink salt lagoons in Mexico's Yucatan. For one reason or another, I've been on a bit of a CDI kick here lately, embarking on an exploration of its library beyond the infamous Hotel Mario and the unholy Triforce of Zelda games on the system. And while I certainly enjoy the endless YouTube poop parodies of those titles' animated cutscenes, I've also wanted to mention some of the system's positives in some way, shape, or form, and I think that talking about music from its catalog of games is the best way for me to approach that. Now, it's worth noting that the Philips CDI wasn't originally marketed as a video game console. It was pitched as an all-in-one multimedia home entertainment device. Something you could use to listen to music, watch films on VCDs, consult an interactive encyclopedia, or even connect to the internet for personal and business applications. The CDI could play video games, since it had a 16/32-bit processor and the capacity for both full-motion video and CD-quality audio, but because video games weren't the initial focus of the machine, it was underpowered compared to its contemporaries, like the Sega CD and the PC Engine's Super CD-ROM, which both made their debuts in 1991 as well. But for a platform that wasn't meant to be gaming-centric, the CDI managed to amass a library with just over 200 titles. And with that many games, there's bound to be some noteworthy soundtracks, especially ones that haven't gotten the appreciation they've deserved, and that's what makes this topic especially exciting to me. The Philips CDI came along at a point in time when CD-quality audio was still fairly new to video games, and because of that, it played a part in the early experimentation that followed. This Wild West period also happened to coincide with the vast improvement of synthesizer quality during the transition between the 80s and the 90s, the era when models like the Korg M1, the Roland D50, and the Roland JD800 were all dominant forces in pop music, television, and film scores. And while the Philips CDI wasn't the first or most notable system to apply that to video games, it was still there as the magic was happening, and I've done my best to comb through its library to find 10 soundtracks that I think are well worth giving a listen to. The games themselves might not be the best out there, but their music certainly does a good job of easing the burden. So put those presumptions aside and let the music do the talking, alright? We've got some real goodies to get into, so let's squat-a-la right on! When looking at the CDI's library of games, one pattern you'll quickly notice is that a lot of the games are relatively simple in structure, with genres like point-and-click adventures, arcade-style shooting galleries, and interactive FMV games being especially common. Much of this, I imagine, was due to the hardware limitations of the system, but simple isn't necessarily a bad descriptor to have. After all, the CDI had its own version of Tetris, the video game that best embodies the phrase simple but effective. And while it's not my favorite version of Tetris, that'd be the Tengen/Atari version, it's definitely one of the most relaxing adaptations of Tetris, entirely due to its FMV backgrounds of natural landscapes and its new age/pop ballad style soundtrack composed by Jim Andren. It's easy to forget that there was a time when everyone wanted to cash in on the Tetris craze, including names as big as Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sega. And because of this, every version of Tetris had its own approach in how to present the game, both in visuals and in music. Korobieniki, the Russian folk song that most people would easily recognize as the Tetris theme, was featured as early as the Apple II GS version, though it was the Game Boy release that truly made it synonymous with falling blocks. And while many others tapped into that same sort of folksy Russian iconography, others, like the Philips CDI version, opted to do something completely different. I've heard people compare Jim Andren's take on Tetris music to Vaporwave on more than a few occasions, and as someone who used to be into the Vaporwave subculture during the mid to late 2010s, I can definitely agree with that comparison. The distinct sound of 90s electronic pianos backed by reverb-heavy synth pads give it that kind of comforting yet melancholic vibe that vaporwave music loves to use. And the actual gameplay doesn't include sound effects as the tetrominoes fall into place either. You're just left with the serenity of the music, paired with backgrounds of waterfalls, mountains, and deserts. As cliché as it may be to use the term aesthetic to describe the experience, I think it's perfectly justified here. Listen to a few of these, and I think you'll understand pretty quickly. Highlighting some specific tracks, though, I definitely like to give a mention to the music for Level 6. It's bright, triumphant, and weirdly Christmassy, for a level whose backdrop is a craggy beach without a snowflake in sight. Perhaps it's a Brazilian or Australian Christmas. Level 1's music is also a noteworthy piece, playing out like an instrumental for a pop ballad or a love song from the 80s-90s transition, maybe even the credits theme for a totally different game. Yeah, it's a little cheesy for that, but cheese is also delicious, especially when it's given the right presentation. But my favorite part of the soundtrack for Tetris on the CDI is the theme for Level 0, because even though it's the backing music for the earliest stage in the game, it also perfectly embodies the general vibe of the experience. Sentimental yet inspiring, and hopeful yet moody, listening to it makes me feel wistful for times and experiences long gone, even if I can't actually identify them. To be honest, I think it sounds like a prototype or predecessor to Dire Dire Docks from Super Mario 64, and that's a very good track to be compared to. As far as I've been able to find, Jim Andron's career as a video game composer was largely spent working on titles for the CDI and various models of personal computers, though he did contribute to a handful of Namco games before retiring from the industry in the early 2000s. Despite that accolade at the end of his career, Tetris on the CDI remains his most well-known soundtrack, and for very good reason. While it might not have the smoothest or most responsive controls, this isn't a version of Tetris you play for the adrenaline of getting a high score or competing against others. This is a version of Tetris you play to sit back, relax, and forget about life's troubles, just for a moment in time. After all, you know you've got something special when the composer officially releases it on vinyl. Granted, it was a limited release, but this score was already a hidden treasure to begin with, so it tracks. One of the best parts about researching the CDI's library of video games is getting to discover titles that were noteworthy at the time, but have since faded into obscurity along with the system itself. Released in 1994, Burn Cycle was considered by many to be the CDI's killer app, the kind of game that was so good that it was worth purchasing a system just for that, even though Burn Cycle was ported to personal computers the very next year. Still, it's probably the most universally praised game on the CDI, and its developers, Trip Media, went all out on making their cyberpunk adventure game feel as cinema quality as they could get out of the hardware, which included hiring film composer Simon Boswell and session percussionist Chris Whitten to handle the soundtrack. Although his career began with scoring for Italian horror films, Boswell did have experience with cyberpunk motifs before working on Burn Cycle, courtesy of his compositions for the film Hardware from 1990. And while I think it'd be fun to compare the two in greater detail, we're here to focus on Burn Cycle's merits. So let's talk about why the music is great, as well as which tracks stand out to me specifically. Just a quick disclaimer before I begin, though. The music is normally cut up into small loops that are scattered across the various scenes and locales, while the actual full-length files are on a separate disc that came packaged with the game. So for the sake of convenience, I'll be using the audio from the soundtrack disc. Now the basic premise of Burn Cycle is that the player assumes the role of a thief for hire named Soul Cutter, who gets infected with a brain-deteriorating virus called the Burn Cycle, only having 2 hours time to find a solution before it leaves him in a permanent vegetative state. From that, you can gather that the game is presented as a race against time with some high-stakes drama, an idea that the main theme definitely conveys. With its wave-like, rising and falling loops set against more intense synth percussion and bass, as well as a piano later in the track, it gives the game's more action-heavy scenes the needed amount of narrative heft, as well as making for one hell of a first impression. Beyond the introduction of Burn Cycle, one of the game's early set pieces is a nightclub full of real people and holograms, where the attendants gamble on mind battles and get high on virtual reality stimulation. As you'd expect, two of the themes associated with this area go for a more acid and house-inspired direction. And that's a very quick way to get high approval from me, especially when it's made with synths from the golden age of the early 90s. It's something I really love about these early CD audio video games, getting to hear some of my favorite music echoed back at me. Other tracks make for great background pieces, not necessarily being toe-tapping bangers, but doing their part to reinforce the bleak, futuristic, and hyper-corporate setting of Burn Cycle. While the game itself is meant to be completed within the 2-hour time limit of the Burn Cycle virus, you do actually have some wiggle room to take in the scenery if that's what you want to do. And pieces like these really help with immersing yourself in the game's cyberpunk world. And as one last track to mention, Meltdown serves as a nice complement to Burn Cycle's main theme, conveying that same futuristic and dramatic sound, but in a more subdued way. And considering it's the last track on the soundtrack CD, I think it would have fit nicely as the theme for the end credits. Alas, it's not. But that won't stop me from playing the music sample anyways. Sure, Burn Cycle might be cheesy and visually dated by today's standards, but you have to keep in mind that it was a pretty ambitious game for its time, especially given the lengths that Trip Media went to make the game as interactive and cinematic as the CDI could provide. While some aspects of the experience have certainly aged less than gracefully, the soundtrack by Simon Boswell and Chris Whitten has become like a fine wine instead, keeping its quality with age. And while I might not be the most avid consumer of cyberpunk media myself, I feel like the soundtrack could make for great background music while playing other similar games, both contemporary to Burn Cycle and contemporary to today. Just be careful not to accidentally download any mind viruses if you do. I've heard it can lead to some real out-of-body experiences. From vaporwave Tetris and cinematic cyberpunk thrillers, our travels now bring us to a cartoony game about a week in the life of a wizard's bumbling servant. This is The Apprentice. Not to be confused with Merlin's Apprentice, which was also released for the CDI and featured cutscenes similar to the infamous Zelda CDI games. No, this one was a platformer made by Dutch developer The Vision Factory, who produced quite a few games for the Philips CDI. Easily identifiable by their colorful graphics, bawdy sense of humor, and exceptional musical talent. Expect to hear their name more than once before the end of this video. The soundtrack for The Apprentice was done entirely by Joost Eijmond, being the only video game he worked on besides an educational title named Hyper de Piep Ik Lees. I apologize to any Dutch viewers who might be watching. Anyways, it's a bit of a shame that Joost Eijmond contributed to only 2 video games, at least as far as I could find. Because for a video game that's obscure to a point where I had never once heard of it prior to working on this video, The Apprentice has a soundtrack that's both high quality and dips into a variety of genres, definitely flexing Eijmond's compositional talents. There genuinely isn't a bad track to be found here. The whole thing's great from start to finish, and I was quite excited at the prospect of introducing this one to a larger audience. And speaking of introductions, let's start with the first thing you hear after booting the game up. The main title theme for The Apprentice sets the game up as a high fantasy adventure, with medieval-sounding flutes and horns, dramatic and more symphonic strings and brass, and even a piano at one point in the track. It all comes together like an epic quest is about to unfold, almost like this were a role-playing game of some kind. But then when you get into the actual game, the first level's music takes that high fantasy title theme and chucks it straight out of the nearest window, replacing it with jaunty, ragtime piano roll music. When I first heard this tonal bait and switch, I genuinely burst out laughing. It not only embodies the game's sense of humor, but also quickly shows you how flexible of a composer Joost Eijmond is. Forget Mumbo's Mountain from Banjo-Kazooie or Mallow Mart from Twilight Princess. This is the music that gaming YouTubers should be using when they're doing something goofy or mischievous. But beyond Joost Eijmond having a bit of fun pulling the rug from under the player at the beginning of the game, every world of the game goes for a different vibe, both in visuals and in music, and I absolutely adore the theme for the third world, High Tech Tower. It starts off with hard rock guitars that wouldn't sound out of place in a Mega Man X game, then goes into a few flourishes of disco horns before blending the two together for the remainder of the track, even including an incredible electric guitar solo and a lull in which it becomes lounge music before the horns kick back in. I actually had this specific track looping while working on nearly every stage of producing this video, and I think you'll immediately understand why. The Ice Tower theme that follows is definitely my second favorite. It starts with a whistling synth and glittery percussion like you'd expect for a frozen locale, but then it adopts a techno beat for the remainder of the track. And I mean techno, the kind that has that cold, mechanically autonomous sound. That's not even the only development as the track progresses, either. It also brings in a piano, alongside the whistling synth from earlier, to give it a kind of acid jazz adjacent sound when it all comes together, even if it lasts for just a few moments. Pretty cool stuff, and certainly fitting for an ice level, wouldn't you say? Backtracking to the game's second world, The Well, this set of levels uses a much more atmospheric theme than the others. There's more build-up to it, for one, but it also uses a much different set of instruments, including a marimba, a bass guitar, and an occasional high-pitched squealing sound that reminds me of Echo the Dolphin, especially in conjunction with those sloshing water noises. It's even got those creepy choir synths that I swear were also used in the music for the Shadow Temple from Ocarina of Time. Surely you can hear it too, and I'm not going crazy, right? And I have to give a nod to this game's credits theme, because how else do you close an adventure whose backing soundtrack spans multiple styles of music than by adding another one at the very end? Oh yeah, this one gets funky. You know, it's funny that I brought up the credits at the end there, because they don't just list Joost Eijkman as the composer, they label his contributions as magical music. And even if it's meant to be playful, like the rest of the credits, it's still such an apt descriptor, given all the different genres being juggled for this soundtrack. I only shared a slice of what the whole game has to offer, so if you like what you heard, I highly recommend you listen to the full soundtrack, because it gets wilder and more impressive the more you listen in. Perhaps the real wizard was Joost Eijkman all along. This next entry belongs to our second puzzle game of the list, and one that happens to star a certain vintage yellow mascot we all know and love. Pac-Attack, or Pac-Panic as it's known in certain releases, was originally made for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, though the Philips CDI got its own port 2 years later in 1995, one that was exclusive to Europe. Now, I should note that this isn't my favorite version of Pac-Panic's soundtrack. To the surprise of absolutely no one who knows me at even a basic level, it's actually the Genesis version I like the most. It's got that noticeable influence from swing jazz, funk, and new jack swing, and the twin sound chips of the Genesis were practically built for that. However, I do think that Chris Thorne did a decent job of adapting Hiromi Shibano's original compositions into CD quality audio. Combined with the new artwork based on Pac-Man's appearance in Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures, it's something that sets the CDI version apart from all other releases of the game. But it's also a pretty small soundtrack compared to what we've touched on already, so I don't have as many tracks to include samples of. That being said, I can think of no better place to start than with the theme most players will probably hear the most, and that's the theme for Normal Mode. It's a fun little piece that includes a groovy synth rendition of the intermission jingle from the original Pac-Man arcade game. What's there not to love? When it comes to the music for Puzzle Mode, the CDI port of Pac-Panic uses a remix of the theme from the Genesis version, rather than the track that was used in the Super Nintendo, Game Boy, and Game Gear releases. Comparing the CDI and original Genesis versions of this piece, they're pretty similar in quality, though some listening might prefer the cleaner, more natural-sounding drums and vibraphone that are used in the CDI version. I won't play both back-to-back, given that this video is all about CDI soundtracks, so I'll leave it for you to decide on your own time. And then there's the Versus mode, which is particularly elusive as far as the CDI version is concerned. Considering that most models of the Philips CDI didn't put the second controller port in an obvious spot, and emulation is pretty spotty when it comes to additional controller inputs, I can't say I blame you if you've never seen this mode on the CDI version, or heard the music that goes with it. It lacks the same kind of intensity that the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions have, but it's alright. It still gets the job done. Last thing I want to highlight is the music for the name entry screen. It definitely doesn't sound as good as it does on the Genesis, but at least it's easier on the ears than the Super Nintendo version. Consider it a moderate amount of jazzy. Ultimately, I'd say that the CDI release of Pac Attack is probably my second favorite, both in terms of music and visual presentation. It may not be the best version of Pac Attack out there, but not being the best doesn't mean you're automatically bad. Especially when your game is released for a platform that has a particular infamy for poor quality games and awkward hardware. Being decent is a compliment there. As far as I could find, this was Chris Thorne's only credit working on a video game. And that makes it even more noteworthy. You knew this was coming, didn't you? Because it definitely wouldn't be a video about good soundtracks on the CDI if it didn't include the Zelda games that were made for the system. And if I'm being honest, I actually have quite a soft spot for the CDI Zelda games. Well, maybe not Zelda's Adventure, but definitely Zelda the Wand of Gamelon and Link the Faces of Evil. A lot of that probably boils down to how much I like the gameplay style of Zelda 2, something that the franchise hasn't revisited since then. But there's also the notoriously iconic cutscenes that continue to be parodied, some of the background art is genuinely fantastic, and, oh yeah, the music fucking slaps! Both Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon had their soundtracks composed by the duo of Tony Trippi and William Havlicek, and for that reason, as well as their many other similarities, I certainly could have talked about both games in one segment. But there's just too many tracks that I like from each game, so I thought it'd be better to talk about each one separately, starting with Link the Faces of Evil. Now, between the two composers, Tony Trippi mainly spent his career working on PC and CDI games, including, funnily enough, I Am Mean, another game whose animated cutscenes were frequently used in YouTube poofs. William Havlicek's experience with video games, meanwhile, didn't go very far beyond the Philips CDI, at least as far as music and sound design is concerned. The two collaborated several times in their careers, though nothing they worked on gained anywhere near the same degree of notoriety as the Zelda CDI games. And while you do get a small taste of Trippi and Havlicek's contributions from some of the cutscenes, it's nothing compared to what you actually hear for most of the game. While it definitely doesn't sound like the music in a typical Zelda game, it has its own style that's great in its own right, combining the high fantasy sorts of instruments you'd expect with more electronic sounds like synth keyboards, drum machines, and electric guitars. Trying to narrow this whole soundtrack to a few samples was probably one of the most difficult parts of putting this whole thing together, but I think I know a good track that embodies the general structure and vibe of the soundtrack. This piece is from Saragon Caves, and plays as soon as you enter the area. You can immediately hear a synth lead and bass combo with an electronic organ, but it's also mixed with a more traditional percussion selection, consisting of what sounds to me like a tambourine, a guiro, and a conga drum. But in terms of my personal favorites, Militron's part of the map is definitely up there. The overall motif for this area really suits the idea of breaking into a stronghold full of armored knights. So much so that I debated between using the main theme for this area or the Ironworks variant, which goes for more of a rave-like, synth-exclusive sound. But I decided to go with the main version instead. It makes the perfect first impression for this part of the game, and just feels like the most well-rounded of the four variations. Garonu and Lupe are two more of Ganon's minions with fantastic music, which I like for fairly similar reasons. The variations that play as you approach these two honestly sound more like boss themes than the actual music that's used for their boss fights. The area theme for Garonu has this really great call and response section between the two main synth instruments, while Lupe's area theme has a part where the main synth just goes nuts arpeggiating while being accompanied by a wailing electric guitar. This is the kind of thing the soundtracks for the Zelda CDI games love to do, and I'm all for it. I also really like the themes for Hermit Flat, the area just before you enter Ganon's lair. It's a short portion of the adventure, only consisting of Zora's Lake and Guanum's house, but I love how a simple change of instruments makes these two tracks give off totally different vibes. Zora's Lake uses a combination of a funky slap bass, a buzzy sawtooth synth, an electric guitar, and a typical drum set to give it that close to the end of the game sort of sound. The version for Guanum's house, on the other hand, swaps those out for a marimba, a tambourine, and a few other percussion-focused instruments that give it a more folksy sound that suits Guanum himself, even though it's playing nearly the exact same tune. Obviously, I can't talk about every part of the soundtrack in this level of detail, or else this segment would be unbearably long compared to the rest of the video, so the last two pieces I want to bring up are used for areas that don't have bosses. First is the music that plays as you approach Toiku Lighthouse, which sounds more like you're trying to outrun a time bomb or prepare for a marathon, and the other is the track that plays for the lower half of Spearfish Falls, which builds up into this incredible crescendo of energy at the very end of the loop. You can hear something similar in the room where you fight Gleeok too, but I personally prefer this one. At this point, I think you get the idea of how good the music in Link: The Faces of Evil is, even if the game's notoriety means it's also the least surprising of the soundtracks on this list. Still, it warrants repeating that even if the games themselves are a janky mess and the music doesn't sound like something you'd hear in a typical Zelda game, that doesn't mean that the composers didn't try to put their heart and soul into the soundtrack. Quite the opposite, really. And while I'd like to make this conclusion a little longer, we're not actually done talking about William Havlicek and Tony Trippi's contributions to the Philips CDI's library. You'll see what I mean in just a bit. So here's another hidden gem that made me super excited to work on this video, very much in the same boat as The Apprentice. It's also the third puzzle game to be featured, for those of you keeping score at home. Get ready to say cowabunga to Dimo's Quest, everyone! Dimo's Quest was a game that was originally released for Amiga and DOS computers, though it was remade on the CDI 2 years later by none other than the Vision Factory, who wanted to give the game a more cool and radical identity, including its soundtrack, which was reworked with new, CD-quality compositions by Joris de Man. These days, you'd be more likely to recognize Joris de Man from his work on the Killzone and Horizon series, maybe even Gotham Knights, but at the beginning of his career in the video game industry, he was a freelance musician primarily working on games for the CDI. In fact, Dimo's Quest was only his second time producing the audio for a CDI game, and it was his third video game overall. Something fun about this soundtrack in particular is that I could approach it from any angle I want, given all the different level themes seem to be used semi-randomly. So I think I'll let personal preference take precedence and start with the track Whisper Dimo. This one's a great example of the sort of 90s cool style that the Vision Factory wanted to add to their CDI port, utilizing a hip-hop or New Jack Swing sort of beat that's complemented by a piano and a pair of funky, whining synths. And my goodness, do I love the groovy bass line that's going on underneath the main melody. Another one of my favorites is the amusingly named Slow and Annoying, which does indeed go at a slower pace, but it's by no means an annoying piece. It takes its time to get warmed up, but once it does, it gives me similar vibes to Whisper Dimo, though with a triumphant saxophone thrown in for good measure. There's also the aptly named That Happy Tune, which combines cheerful steel drums with a dreamy synth pad, a snappy bass and drum combo, some occasional glittery percussion, and a delightfully warm, warbly lead synth. It's definitely the kind of thing to have on hand if you need a jolt of motivation. Another goodie, and one that's a little different, is Power, which doubles down on those wonderfully 90s sounding pianos, while also letting the saxophone and funky whining synth have some time to shine. It's a level theme like all the others, but there's just something particularly victorious about how it all comes together. Powerful, you might say. But this soundtrack has its more serious themes too. Not everything needs to sound so happy-go-lucky, after all. Level of Death uses an acid house-inspired opening loop to make it immediately stand out, before switching to some more intense percussion and dramatic synth pads, as well as playing the whining synth like an electric guitar. And then there's Spook Level, which just oozes mystery and danger with its suspenseful chords, unusual percussion, and subtle, ghostly moans. Both of these add some much appreciated variety to the soundtrack by conveying an audible sense of challenge. While the CDI version of Dimo's Quest might have committed the grave offense of frog protagonist erasure by trying to feature a hip and cool skater dude instead, it also helped serve as a springboard of sorts for Yoris Damon. Because if it weren't for Dimo's Quest and a few others on the CDI, we'd be living in a timeline where games like Horizon Zero Dawn and Killzone 2 would sound very different from what we know, assuming they'd even exist in that timeline. Hell of a butterfly effect, isn't it? Digging into the library of the Philips CDI can turn up a good surprise every now and again. And as a great example, could you imagine my shock to learn that there was a pretty decent side-scrolling beat-em-up for the CDI? Akin to Streets of Rage, Undercover Cops, or Final Fight? It was even developed by Animation Magic, the same studio behind Link the Faces of Evil and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon, complete with the awkwardly animated cutscenes we all know and love them for, though these have a noticeable amount of polish to them. This is Mutant Rampage Bodyslam, and you know what else it has in common with the Zelda CDI games? Having its music produced by Tony Trippi. And since you've already heard some of his work from Link the Faces of Evil, you know he's got some fantastic compositional skills. Even William Havlicek was involved with this game too, although with a less direct role. Of course, Mutant Rampage Bodyslam is a different beast from the Zelda CDI games, which means that it warrants its own musical style. Instead of using the mixed high fantasy and electronic instrumentation from those games, Mutant Rampage Bodyslam goes for more of a hard rock sort of sound, with an occasional influence from hip-hop and electronic dance music. I should also clarify that none of the tracks you're about to hear have official titles, at least as far as I'm aware. So I'm gonna borrow the nicknames given to them by Soundwaves, the channel who uploaded the whole thing to YouTube. After all, it beats calling them Track 1, Track 2, Track 6, and so on. Now, in my opinion, the defining part of this soundtrack would be its fifth track, which Soundwaves gave the nickname Rocksteady to. This one, like most of the music, plays at various points in the game instead of just one location. And I have to say, the overall instrumentation reminds me quite a bit of TMNT Turtles in Time, especially the distinctive, quack-sounding orchestral hits. Really makes me wonder if that's why Soundwaves gave it the nickname Rocksteady. After all, there's another track they nicknamed Bebop, which has more of the soundtrack's hip-hop influence, so I guess it's only right to play some back-to-back samples of these two. Another one of the stage themes I like has the alias On Fire. I mainly enjoy this one for the electronic organ and warbly synths that take up the second half of the loop. It takes a bit of waiting for them to kick in, but once they do, oh man, that gets me in the zone. Also great is Electrified, which has a distinct swagger to it, between the way the electric guitar is being played and the underlying rhythm the bass is providing. The drums are great too, and the way it all comes together makes me feel like I could be the boss of any place I walk into while this is being blasted by a nearby speaker. Or maybe that's just me chewing the scenery here. I'd love to give a little shout out to the main menu theme as well. Sort of like the track Bebop that I mentioned earlier, this one leans into more of the hip-hop style of the soundtrack, though it plays out in phases of hip-hop, hard rock, and a mix between the two as it shifts. It's good stuff, though I can't imagine most people listen to the whole loop through. While I've mentioned that this game's music goes for more of a hard rock style, there actually are some tracks that don't sound too far off from the Zelda CDI games, with two in particular that I want to bring up. The track that's nicknamed City best embodies this. I could easily imagine it working as an area theme in Link the Faces of Evil, thanks in large part to the added triangle and conga drum in the percussion, both of which give it that familiar sound. And the other piece that comes to mind is Special Forces, which plays for a few of the game's boss battles. It's funny I say that too, because it honest to goodness sounds like one of the boss room themes from the Zelda CDI games. You'll get what I mean pretty quickly once you hear it. Ultimately, while there isn't as much to talk about with this game's soundtrack as some of the others I've brought up, I find it really interesting that Mutant Rampage Bodyslam seem to go completely under the radar, given how infamous animation magic is thanks to the duo of Link the Faces of Evil and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. No one really talks about this game being one of the better titles the CDI has to offer, the improved animation quality in its cutscenes, or, of course, the great soundtrack. Which leads me to believe that if this game had come out on any other platform besides the Philips CDI, it might have been a surprise hit. A quirky, post-apocalyptic side-scrolling beat-em-up being released at a time when several games were trying to emulate Streets of Rage or Final Fight's success could have actually had some leverage. But I suppose you can't call it buried treasure if it isn't actually buried, now can you? Let me start this next segment with a little disclaimer before I inevitably say something that makes me look stupid. I'm not terribly familiar with the Belgian comic strip Lucky Luke or any of its associated media, but I know that it's popular in its native Europe. So for a platform made and supported by a Dutch company, it's pretty natural that there'd be a Lucky Luke game on the Philips CDI. And a very visually impressive one, too, with background and character art that could honestly pass for a 2D platformer on the Sega Saturn or the original PlayStation. Only one company could have done this on the Philips CDI, and I think you've figured it out already, because yes indeed, this one was developed by the Vision Factory, with Joris de Man in charge of the music once again. Indeed, the same composer who worked on the CDI adaptation of Dimo's Quest was involved with this one too. Though just like the game in the last segment, most of this soundtrack doesn't have official track names, as far as I could tell. So for the sake of convenience, I decided to give them some basic titles that at least reflect where they play in-game. Now, I've brought up first level themes quite a few times in this list so far, but that's because they're usually a good way to gauge what a game's soundtrack at large is like. And in the case of Lucky Luke the video game, 3 of the 4 stages leading up to the first boss all use the same music. It's got that familiar funkiness you might remember from Dimo's Quest, but this time it's paired with a much more old western coat of paint, with instrumentation that includes a slide guitar, a honky-tonk piano, a banjo, and a harmonica. It definitely sets the stage for an adventure in the Wild West, while also showing that even early in his career, Joris de Man had plenty of flexibility as a musician. It's good stuff. After each boss battle against the Dalton brothers, you get a bonus stage that's presented like a classic arcade shooting gallery, where you have to hit a certain quota of targets before running out of time or bullets. It's a fun little distraction to earn some additional points, as well as an extra life, but I'm not kidding when I say that it's also got the swankiest sounding music in the whole game. On paper, the combination of an electronic organ, a drum set, some bongos, a bass guitar, an electric guitar, an acoustic guitar, and a banjo sounds a bit too busy or wacky to work for such a short diversion, but I mean, just listen to this! Not all of the game's levels play the same, however, as there's a number of stages where you have to follow a train or caravan while riding on Jolly Jumper, or pursue one of the Dalton brothers in a minecart, and these vehicle-themed stages each have their own unique music. The Jolly Jumper levels have my second favorite track in the game, being driven by a central combination of a groovy bass guitar and a more rock and roll style electric guitar, though they also provide some space for the banjo and harmonica to join in. The theme for the minecart levels, meanwhile, pairs the electric and bass guitars with a heavier element of percussion, as if mimicking the clattering of the rails. The brass stabs and castanets are the cherry on top, though. But in terms of sounding the most like Joris de Man's previous work with Dimo's Quest, I have to give that honor to the levels set out in the desert. This one goes at a slower pace compared to all the other level themes, and takes a bit to get going, but the bass definitely sounds like something out of Dimo's Quest. And while it certainly isn't the only thing you hear, I do like that it gets to be the focus of at least one part of the soundtrack. And just for fun, I feel like I should mention that there are a handful of circus-themed levels in the second half of the game, with accompanying music that starts with a classic circus motif from Julius Fučík's Entry of the Gladiators, and transitions into a much more intense piece befitting the end of the game. This is largely driven by the electric guitar and organ combo, but the tambourines and groaning synths are nice additions too. That just about finishes all there is to say about Lucky Luke, the video game, as it's another one of those games with a smaller soundtrack compared to what you could find on other contemporary systems, or even within the CDI's own library. Yeah, it's no Sunset Riders, and there are definitely better Lucky Luke games out there, but to repeat something I said earlier, being decent on a platform that was known to be underpowered and difficult to work with is an achievement. And having Joris de Man involved with the audio production makes that quality stand out even more. This was still early in his freelance career, but he proved he could effectively work spaghetti western motifs and instrumentation into his usual style. And between this and Dimo's Quest, it's like we've been listening to the stepping stones leading up to his modern career, hasn't it? Oh boy, this game is really gonna test the whole finding good, even in terrible games narrative I've been pushing, isn't it? So for those who might not be familiar, Rise of the Robots was a game that went down as one of the most spectacular flops of the fourth generation. A somewhat generic fighting game that was massively hyped up as a technical marvel that would feature graphics and artificial intelligence so advanced they'd change the entire industry. Publisher Time Warner Interactive confidently believed that it would be successful enough to launch action figures, comic books, and even a feature-length film. Only for the game to turn out to be an absolute train wreck that cost the company millions in advertising alone. Amidst the ambitious marketing campaign was a tagline that the game would include a soundtrack composed by the one and only Brian May of Queen fame. Now, May did in fact produce a full soundtrack for Rise of the Robots, but it was withheld from initial release by his associated label, EMI. This forced the game's developers, UK-based Mirage Technologies, to come up with a second soundtrack from scratch, though 2 tracks from Brian May's solo album, Back to the Light, were still featured in most versions of the game, those being The Dark and Resurrection. The backup soundtrack used in most releases of Rise of the Robots, including the Philips CDI, was spearheaded by Richard Joseph, an experienced composer with a long list of credits for a variety of platforms, including the Commodore 64, Atari ST, Commodore Amiga, MS-DOS, and Sega Genesis. He was writing the new music on very short notice, so you can't really expect a masterpiece from this one, but I still think it's decent enough to be noteworthy, and probably one of the few things you can genuinely compliment when you're talking about Rise of the Robots. Now, the CDI release wasn't the only version of Rise of the Robots that used CD-quality audio, as the 3DO, Amiga CD32, and MS-DOS releases were also published on compact discs. That makes this segment a little less special, since the soundtrack wasn't originally made for the CDI, but that's not gonna stop me either. So let's just jump right into the thick of it with my favorite part, the music that plays when fighting the Crusher. It's got an immediate sense of intensity to it, and several of the backing instruments sound quite a bit like something you'd hear in a Sega Genesis game, mainly the bass and percussion. You know, now that I say that out loud, I think I might have just figured out why I like it so much. Going back a bit, I also really like the Loader's theme, with its acidic synths that sound like they'd be right at home at an underground British rave in the summer of 1991. It gives me definite flashbacks to the original mix of the KLF's What Time Is Love, but given that the Loader is the very first opponent in the game, its stage theme is also the shortest in the soundtrack, so there isn't much more I can add to that. Let the audio sample do the talking. That rave-like style carries over into the music for the Builder's stage, and I especially like the added siren that periodically enters and exits. You can hear the same siren in one other track, but I think it really suits this one more. It certainly makes me wonder what even goes on at a construction site that uses gorilla robots and rave music. What are you building? The Sentries theme is one that I debated if I wanted to include or not, as it takes quite a bit before it gets good since, quite frankly, the beginning of the track sounds really goofy in its uncompressed form, compared to the Super Nintendo version. Once the electric guitars kick in, though, it gets much better and way more fitting for the penultimate opponent. You can't make this guy look intimidating with nothing but cheery, high-pitched ice-level synths. After that track that I was a little unsure of, I think it's only right that we end with something that's good through and through, and that's the music that goes with the final boss of the game, the Supervisor. This one's perfect for where it plays, especially for how it goes through parts that sound tense and parts that sound more triumphant, really reflecting the idea of a battle between two combatants with opposing ideas. And that's about all the CDI soundtrack for Rise of the Robots has to offer, barring a few unused tracks that aren't particularly noteworthy. I'm not gonna do anything here to defend the actual game part of Rise of the Robots, because it really is a terrible experience on every platform it was released for, not just the CDI version. At the very least, we can commend Richard Joseph's efforts to try and add something salvageable to an otherwise bland game, and on such short notice, too. Replacing a soundtrack is never an easy feat, especially with the sheer amount of marketing exposure that Rise of the Robots had. Despite that, Richard Joseph wasn't brought back for the sequel that somehow happened, so I think we know exactly why that one failed. Don't voluntarily subject yourself to these games. Just enjoy the music instead. So this is probably the cheesiest way to end our little list here, and I'm guessing you could see this coming from a mile or kilometer away, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Let's talk about the other Zelda game that Animation Magic made for the Philips CDI. Now you might be wondering why I saved Zelda the Wand of Gamelon for last, since I already talked about Link the Faces of Evil earlier in the video. I already mentioned that there were just too many tracks I liked to warrant talking about both games in one segment, but I also think that Wand of Gamelon is the better of the two. I like the idea of having a game where Zelda herself gets to be the protagonist. It doesn't have the annoying snowball and fireball collecting that Faces of Evil does, and even if the musical differences are minute, since the same musicians worked on both games at the same time, I think the soundtrack is slightly better. And so, because of all of that, I thought it would be the better game to end this video with. For the most part, the various things I said about Faces of Evil's soundtrack also apply to Wand of Gamelon's soundtrack. And while there's definitely a heavy overlap between the two, I also believe that both games have their own little musical nuances. As a good example, Wand of Gamelon utilizes pianos much more than Faces of Evil does, and this is definitely a factor in why I prefer this soundtrack over the other, because Tony Trippi and William Havlicek can crank out some serious bangers with their hands at the ivory keys. Just listen to these two pieces from Shutoy Lake and Resong Palace, which showcase this perfectly. Another one of my favorite tracks that does things a little differently from Link the Faces of Evil is the music that plays inside the cathedral of the Sakado Graveyard. Now, the version that plays in the graveyard itself is pretty great as is, especially for the sounds of wailing ghosts that you can hear if you listen hard enough, but the cathedral version swaps those out for a church organ, one that's being played by Gibdo himself. Perhaps that's where Ganondorf got the idea in Ocarina of Time. He was just missing the funky synth accompaniment, though. In a more general sense, Hanyu Forest is another area with music I really enjoy. It's a little cheesy, but I always love when a wooden marimba is used for forest levels in video games, to give it an immediately natural tonal flavor. The added woobly-warbly synths make it feel mystical, and the Gamelon-esque percussion is an especially clever touch. Get it? Because the game is called Wand of Gamelon? Similarly woodsy in setting, but more experimental in audio, is Washubi Swamp, whose music centers around a funky bass line, though the defining feature to me is the ample percussion, which utilizes a combination of a guiro and a kabasa in a way that seems to imitate the sound of a rattlesnake's tail, adding a sense of danger. Get ready to dance out that snake venom as you make your way out of these thickets. Swinging back into more immediate favorites, anything that's within the area of the Gobion ship is fantastic, though I personally enjoy the version that plays as you approach the ship the most. There's a very adventurous quality to it, even though the actual swashbuckling hasn't started just yet, and it's done in such a wonderfully early 90s way. This is the kind of music you fight pirates to, assuming you have long hair, wear clashing colors, and use a keytar as your weapon of choice. Kobutan is another great area audio-wise, though you'd probably recognize it as that area with the odd level design that doesn't follow a consistent perspective before you'd even think about its background music. This one's got a strong drum beat that forms the crux of the theme, though it's also accented by a flute that gives it an additional medieval/high fantasy flavor. And it's mainly because of that flute that this area is probably the closest that the CDI Zelda games come to sounding like the real deal. That or Guanum's house from Faces of Evil, but I'm letting myself get off track here. I'll let the music do the talking before I get distracted again. But for our last audio sample of the video, I have to go with the map theme, as this was something I didn't get into when I was talking about Link: The Faces of Evil. Between the two, Wand of Gamelon has the better world map theme by a landslide, and I believe it's the perfect track to use as a send-off for this video, because it's probably the best piece from either of the CDI Zelda games developed by Animation Magic. Tony Trippi and William Havlicek made two whole soundtracks full of surprisingly good and varied pieces, but this has to be the one where they peaked. It perfectly encapsulates the feeling of adventure and figuring out where to go next. No joke, I've caught myself humming this one on multiple occasions. It's that good. It really is incredible how much of a difference there is between the actual gameplay of the Zelda CDI games and the soundtracks that accompany both experiences. Did I start making this video to gush about Wand of Gamelon in particular? Yep, I'm guilty as charged. Is it corny to end said video like this? Yeah, it kind of is. But is this soundtrack one of the best you'll find on the Philips CDI? You bet your ass it is. And I wouldn't have had this conclusion any other way. And thus ends our little foray into the musical offerings of the Philips CDI. I tried my best to dig into its library to find some soundtracks that I'm certain few people have heard before, and while some of these are certainly more subjective than others, I certainly hope that it gave you a newfound sense of perspective on what's often regarded as one of the worst video game systems of all time. The Philips CDI is a surprisingly interesting platform beyond the infamy of its Mario and Zelda games. It was initially imagined and sold as an all-in-one home entertainment device, but when that wasn't selling as many units as anticipated, and Philips tried to reorient the machine as a full-fledged video game console, the developers working on titles often lacked the necessary experience to make and test games, while the CDI itself was already underpowered and facing next-gen competition from the far more popular Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. In other words, its ambitions were admirable, but its failure was inevitable. But that's the past, and for better or worse, it's all beyond our ability to change it. We live in a world that's over 30 years removed from the launch of the Philips CDI, and yet most discussion of the platform still centers on the failed partnership between Philips and Nintendo, as well as the handful of games that resulted. Sure, there's a debate to be had as to how many titles on the CDI were actually video games or just software, but no matter how underwhelming or unsuccessful of a platform it was, it still bore witness to that incredible Wild West era when the medium got to embrace CD-quality audio for the first time. The musicians who got to work with the CDI certainly took that to heart, with the system being a launching pad for a few prominent European composers like Joris de Man, and its library has its hidden gems just waiting to be discovered. After all, you got to learn about 10 of them today. In any case, for those of you still watching, I just want to say thank you for making it all the way through. It means a lot to know that you stuck around to the end. So, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever time of day it is for you, and take care.